This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Marianne Lewis. She has a book out called Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. As the dean of a business school, she's got some perspectives. But ultimately, what she's giving here in her newest work with her co-author, Wendy Smith, is a toolkit for navigating. And look, you know me. I want systems. I want processes. Because there are so many intractable problems that we're dealing with on a nonstop basis. How can we step back and look at whatever that discomfort is, whatever the turbulence is, whatever the problem is? How can we look at it, take a step back and look at it with clear eyes to go about solving or navigating the situation? Without any further delay from me, let's jump right into my guest today, Marianne Lewis. Marianne, going through your work, I noticed, and it only happened a couple times, and I thought this could be a great place to jump in. It's such a delicate subject. I don't even know the word to describe it because somebody is going to say, however I describe it is wrong. But if I would just say, okay, there are some examples that you use in your work of racial issues in America. Maybe we could call it racial strife, racial violence. There's a couple examples that come up in your work. It's kind of pronounced because it stands out. Like early on in the foreword, I saw George Floyd's name was mentioned. And then later on, a terrible incident that happened in South Carolina, a mass killing, I believe. But maybe this is a great place. And you state this in your work. You say, look, people are going to have different points of view. They're going to look at things from different angles. Nobody is saying any of these acts are good things by any stretch of the imagination. So let me ask how you brought these types of examples, and feel free to elaborate as much as you want, how you decided to use these types of examples to bring people into your thinking for this particular book.
I appreciate that start because you're really starting at one of the most wicked problems that I think we face. And the point of this book, Both and Thinking, and our work has always been to bring a multiplicity of views into our most challenging problems so we don't lean into what can be the comfort of this either or mindset where we continue to do what we've always done without opening Pandora's box to really get at what are the bigger intricacies, challenges, unintended consequences. The work that Wendy Smith, my co-author, and I have done really for almost 25 years now has primarily been in organizations and with leaders. So we started around issues that, in comparison to racial challenges, seem tame. These are issues of how do you innovate? How do you set up a stronger culture for organizational change? Not easy issues by any stretch, but when you actually put down the more challenging racial issues, it gets your mind thinking. You can almost feel it in your chest, that discomfort. But in our view, to get comfortable with both and thinking, you have to become comfortable in this discomfort. You have to be willing to have these conversations out in the open. You're talking about racial issues. I mean, I'm the dean of a business school. I can talk about them from my own leadership, but from a both and approach, the challenge is, how do we actually talk through the tensions that we might face? This could be inclusion and diversity, even though we often put them in the exact same phrase, like D&I or something, actually can pull us in different directions. As we seek to build more diversity onto our teams, into our organizations, for me, into my student body and my faculty, how do we also make sure that people can be their individual selves, really be their most distinctive, because that's the value of diversity, and do so in a way that also brings us together. So you can feel this kind of separating and connecting happening. Another example that we hear often in discussions of racial tensions are meritocracy versus diversity. To me, this brings us immediately why I have a challenge, and I want to challenge either or thinking. Why would these be opposing? But it's part of the way we think about them. We think that merit is strictly about performance and diversity is strictly about makeup versus thinking about, well, If we have our most diverse, brightest minds around the table, won't our performance collectively enhance, let alone our individual learning be fueled? So we brought in the racial examples very specifically to say, here's a place that we could all start today, having better discussions, listening more, learning together to start to crack more wicked challenges.
This is not to replay an event or anything. This is my perspective as somebody who was living in Asia at the time. Okay, I see the George Floyd situation unfold. Terrible situation. The trial has happened. The officer has been sent to jail. The unfortunate part for me is what I observe it is what has happened after. I can't help but think that the way that that happened has been extrapolated out, that for some people, they think this is a regular, nonstop daily event, whereas the statistics of rogue cops, bad cops going off the rails, so to speak, are in absolute numbers relatively small. That's a part that really frustrates me. And I don't know from your perspective in the work that you're laying out, how that starts to be something that we can work towards, because what I just laid out is not something I see laid out generally. It's talked about, but people are afraid to say it because you might get pinched or something, but it's not terribly controversial.
Michael, I'd give you an interesting example. I mean, a lot of our work is around paradoxes, which means interwoven contradictions. But a favorite paradox that I often return to, a fellow named Barson wrote about it in some of his work, is the paradox of rising expectations. The reason you make me think of this is I think we see this quite a bit, whether it's racial or gender equality issues. It's not that things aren't improving. They are improving. And in fact, these are more rare. And it's okay to say that they are more rare. And the point of the paradox of rising expectations is the more hope we see for a better future, the more frustrated we are by not getting there faster. So when situations happen, you say, not again, right? It actually triggers in us this mix of hope and frustration that collide, and you can feel the angst. One of the reasons I really liked Farson's positioning on this paradox of rising expectations is he makes this point that you don't have this kind of angry, vehement, vocal outrage among groups or in cultures or settings that are really downtrodden, because there is no hope. In fact, if you have silence in these cases, it's because there is literally no belief that this can be better. Right now, I find some gratitude to say we're not quiet. In fact, the voices are quite loud. Sometimes those loud voices can have some unintended consequences because others can listen and say, but wait a minute, look how far we've come. I would like to pose that, yes, we have, and those voices are the push to say this paradox of progress, that the more you progress, the further you can see into the future of a better opportunity. I note that because I think you're right, that we probably aren't calling out enough of the progress that's been made in terms of racial and gender. And when you call those out, people are quick, rightly so, to say, we still have a long way to go. I see those two pieces, the hope and the frustration, impacting in situations like the George Floyd. And I hope that we can then use these better in the future to continue to learn and progress. I don't think it means washing away what's happened in the past. I think we should be proud of developments. And I think we should also be hopeful and pushing to continuously improve. That was some of what we wrote in the book when we were talking about the South Carolina example, is it takes a collective, purposeful discussion ongoing to say, what's next? And to do it in a way that's proactive and positive, as well as calling out the negative.
I'm sure some people listening are waiting for somebody like me to bring back an issue that you brought up a moment ago. You talked about meritocracy and diversity, presenting it as something that's not either or. I can think of the example most recently of Asian students reaching the scores that have been used for so many decades, the typical scores that I did not have good enough to get into Harvard, but the typical scores, SATs, grades, etc., to get into Harvard, and that they've got to score a heck of a lot higher to get in than white or black students. And there is some definite bias there, at least. I mean, some people might call it diversity, other people might call it bias. I can also think of a situation, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. There was a magnet school there called Thomas Jefferson. probably one of the best magnet schools in the country. It started when I was in high school. It was a local high school and they changed it. TJ, as they called it, the deal is when you were in 8th grade, you take the test and then you get into TJ. After that 30-year experiment of TJ, one of the best magnet schools in America, they decided that they didn't like the distribution after 30 years, which was approximately 75% Asian kids. And so in the last year, TJ has scrapped that. I bring these examples up for you to hit me back and say, what am I missing? Because I'm the fairness guy here. I'm looking at it and I'm saying, you know what? If those, quote, Asian kids, and here I am speaking to you from Asia, if those Asian kids have the grades and they're the ones that really, really pushed, the same way that I didn't push, so they got in and I didn't get in. And I said this to someone the other day, if it's on merit, then why can't those kids win? Because America loves to have its black-white conversation, but if you added the Asian component, it changes things. It's really difficult for me. I'm willing to listen to where, okay, maybe I'm presenting an either-or scenario, but someone's got to lose if it's no longer based on merit.
I think this is such an important issue. I think about this one so often, especially in my leadership as a dean, but also with businesses who are discussing the same issue. So I would suggest a couple of things to consider here. When we talk about meritocracy versus diversity, and I would prefer to say and diversity, the first question I would stress is, what is merit? Because so much comes into that definition as well. So there are two pieces, I think, to this. The first is a brilliant book that I loved by Todd Rose called End of Average, and he is the head of, I think, educational psychology at Harvard. His point about the end of average is that talent is jagged. Brilliance and contributions comes in many shapes and forms, and that in many cases, some of our instruments, like the SAT and ACT, which I believe in fully as really valid instruments to recognize certain elements of intellect. They're very good at that.
But those instruments were the primary instruments for you and I and all of our peers to get selected to assorted colleges and universities in the last 50 years or 40 years, whatever it was. That's been the primary way, and we all kind of accepted it. It does look like that's changing.
I do think it's changing because what Rose is stressing is that given the jagged approach to talent, meaning we could be really, really high, say in creativity and in specific kind of design elements and low in specific mathematical elements. But what are we trying to do is we craft a class as we're really thinking about, now we're talking about students, or maybe we're talking about teams. We could do either one. We want to make sure the right people are around the table so that there is as much learning going around between the members on that table as, say, the quote unquote experts, whether it's a teacher or a supervisor or a leader at the table. If we only use very specific instruments, you miss the opportunity to what we would call crafting a class or crafting a team. How do you make sure the right people are around that table? I'll give you a couple of examples that immediately makes me think of Michael. One is growing up, I grew up in Palo Alto, California, in Palo Alto High, right across the street from Stanford. I used to babysit for, I'm old now, I'm 55. I babysat for the dean of admissions, one of the deans. I don't remember which level he was at Stanford. And I would ask him, this is as like a 15-year-old, so I'm not even in the game yet. And I said, how in the world do you select people? And he said, well, really, if you just look at the numbers, they're all the same. There's a ceiling in these test scores. So he said, our biggest challenge is to figure out how do we have an incoming class that these students will learn as much from each other as they will anyone else. Now, I can't speak to what schools like Stanford do now, but that was kind of an epiphany moment to me because I thought, okay, so you've got a lot of perfect scores or somewhere between, say, the 90th percentile to the perfect scores. And then the real question is, who needs to be around that table to be learning? Then a more recent example, and I won't call out the school, but I was talking to a fellow dean, and he said an issue that I've seen, and he said, oh, we have an amazingly international program now. It's about 99% Chinese. And I said, but that's not an international program. That's a Chinese program. And that's perfectly fine if that's what you want to be.
Was it just an open admission, though, and it just so happened that it ended up with the highest test scores were the Chinese kids?
Yes, I think that's exactly what happened. And they were then in this pinch point, because we had this in my school at London. We said, one of the reasons people come to London, especially to a business school in London, is for the international experiences that you can't replicate having an international team. Either you have an international team or you don't have an international team. We had a lot of these challenging discussions about, is it bias? Is it? And we said, but these students are all in this very high echelon bandwidth, but we wanted every MBA team to look like a mini UN, because then through their projects, the learning is so powerful across their intellectual, cultural divides. It is hugely eye-opening. And it made for difficult discussions because we then said, we have to look at it as band. Let's understand what the band is. All of the areas of talent we want represented in a case like the business school I was at in London, and the cultural differences we wanted on each team. We had to get really purposeful. So yes, it was about meritocracy, but it was a broader basket of what merit looked like so we could fuel the kind of learning, creativity, ambitions that we wanted across those students. And I hear leaders say the same thing in organizations. Yes, they want super smart people, but smart is a very subjective term.
If I was to ask you the counter argument for why some people might say, maybe even those Chinese kids, say, hold on, you guys said this was the admissions process. This is what I had to score. And then there's arguably behind a curtain, somebody selecting based on factors that are not seen or not known. How do you reply to people to that concern? Because I'm the type of person where it's like, if all the Asian kids got the highest scores at Harvard and Harvard was all 100% Asian, conceptually, philosophically, I'm okay with that. However, you are swaying me to the perspective of if all the kids from China get the highest scores and they all want to come to Harvard and it's all Chinese kids, then are they even getting what they wanted?
Michael, that's exactly what we're hearing. We're hearing both parents and students looking around a room and saying, wait a minute, I could have done this in China.
This is a mess, isn't it?
It's certainly messy. I mean, this is about why selectivity isn't just a score. It doesn't make for easy conversations, but you need to have those conversations because what you're looking for then, and Stanford has done this since I was that kid in Palo Alto and said, this is why it's a whole application process and not only scores. We have to make decisions because there will be selection. So it doesn't mean every perfect score is an automatic in, because you also have to say, okay, we want everyone in that pool to have the absolute best learning experience possible.
Inherent in our conversation so far, people might not be thinking of these words, but it's inherent in so far what we've talked about, tensions, dilemmas, paradoxes. It's all right there, isn't it?
It's all there. Because the reason why I believe in the power of paradoxes, and I realize paradox sounds pretty abstract. There was a time where both Wendy and me, people said, don't even use that word. It's too philosophical. It's too abstract. But to us, it's a much stronger word than a dilemma. A dilemma immediately pushes to you that you got to make a trade-off, weigh the pros and cons, make a decision, move on. Our view of both and thinking is a shift towards this paradox mindset. If you think about what can feel like oppositions, but also see them as interwoven, yes, we want the meritocracy in a variety of different things that are about success. And we want diversity that brings us together. I'm picturing the yin yang. I love the symbol. I think it's really powerful.
I'm looking at it, page 23 of your book. I'm looking at it right now.
The beauty of a yin yang is the black and white slivers are not just two sides of a coin. They're also blending and moving into each other. You can feel that kind of flow in that there are these dots on both sides, which is basically to signal that in the dark patch, in the darkest of times, even a pinprick of light starts to shine through and brings you on into that ebb and flow, waning and waxing. I mean, there are all these terms that go to the yin yang. In learning, to me, this is about why the diversity and the meritocracy together enable a much more powerful learning experience, one that enables growth and creativity and push, and it's messy. And if you don't admit that it's messy, I think we're actually succumbing to an overly positivistic, rational approach that isn't real because it's more complicated than that.
So I love being a guy doing this particular interview with you while I'm seated in Saigon, Vietnam, while I've been in Asia for 10 years. And it doesn't make a difference what country I go to. Homogeneity is the name of the game. So while I can look in the abstract and say, well, yes, okay, why would all the Chinese kids necessarily want to all go to Harvard and then dominate the slots? But they might all say, well, hold on. If we get the grades and if we come to Harvard and we get the limited slots and we get to talk to David Gergen and we get to have all this educational moments, then we get to go home and take all these experiences back to a society and a culture that is homogenous and is not diverse. And it's not going to change anytime soon. Japan's not going to change anytime soon. Vietnam's not going to change anytime soon. A lot of smaller countries in Europe are not going to change anytime soon. So America is this unique situation where diversity is used quite a bit, but it's not necessarily the same around the world. This is another one of these, quote, paradox, perhaps.
I guess I would push on that with the paradox that we often think about between global and local. Because I don't disagree at all that you can be in certain situations that are highly homogenous by the nature of the makeup of, say, a country or a community or even a team. But the world is so interconnected now. You look at the policies of China, they are so international. Do we really help those students be international players if we don't provide them the learning that helps them cross, let alone understand alternative cultures? I would say no. This is certainly also a personal view of my own, because I said I grew up in Palo Alto. I also grew up in Boston. We moved back and forth many times. My dad was an academic. And my rebellion was I came to the Midwest. There are phenomenal schools around this country and around this world. There is the power of a brand like Harvard, and I don't disrespect that brand whatsoever. But, I think there's so much you can do across any institution when it's really about learning. And to me, learning is about personal growth and critical thinking. And that takes diversity of views to push us out of our comfort zone.
You bring up a great point that a conversation I had with a fund manager several years ago. He had informed me, I don't believe he had much of an academic pedigree at all, but later on in life, he had had some fund management success. So he went to, perhaps it was an executive program of some sort at Harvard. But I realized in talking with him, he just wanted the brand. He just wanted the brand. The education was immaterial. It was like, can I just slap the brand behind my name? You bring up another interesting issue, which is, like, I went to George Mason for undergrad. I went to Florida State for grad school. They're nice schools, but they're not Harvard or anything like that. Ultimately, learning never stops if somebody wants to live a life that way. So you bring up a great point about chasing the brand or chasing the education and people perhaps being too focused on the shiny objects.
It is my stance. I'm sitting in Cincinnati right now at the University of Cincinnati. And what I love is that we have an enormous responsibility when you don't carry a brand like Harvard or Stanford to truly transform. This is about transformational learning. And that's what we offer. I know that Harvard and Stanford provide tremendous opportunities for that, but I don't think the bar is as high that we have to do that at schools like I'm at, probably at Florida State and George Mason that you were at. I mean, that's why we're here. But it pushes us all to think about then, how do you craft a class? How do you make sure that you make every classroom experience, team experience, as impactful as possible? And I'm going to argue that one of the ways that you do that is through diversity, purposeful diversity, not necessarily in a strict quota type of way. I'm not trying to say that, but thinking about what are the different areas of talent and perspectives you want around those tables.
Let me throw a word out at you: stability. It seems like to me, and I write investment books about a quant strategy that is not involved with stability at all. It's all about uncertainty. It's all about volatility. And it's all about experiencing it and understanding that it's going to happen. That's part of life. And how do you manage it? And how do you adapt to it? It seems like that's a perfect jump into your world too, because so many young people, so many adults, somewhere along the line, they've come up with this idea that I'm going to have this nice, stable existence. The through line is going to be perfectly non-volatile, no black swans. Everything's going to be smooth. It's the exact opposite. Like, there's no examples in history or life where it's just smooth sailing. It's just not part of the game.
And there's a paradox between stability and change, because you do need some areas of stability in your life as a foundation from which to jump, to take risks, to move forward. But one of the ways I tend to think about the paradoxical nature of stability is thinking it more of like improvisation. Improvisation is a really cool paradoxical concept, because whether it's jazz or comedy, and we do some work with Second City and others, it means basically rules. within which you can be really agile and flexible. But they give you something to kind of hold on to as you're jumping, as you're moving into the unknown. They're frameworks. A lot of the work that we'll do and I will do with organizations is to think about what do those frameworks look like for you? How do they provide some stability, some guardrails as you're moving into the unknown to guide your work and to give you some comfort in the discomfort you're moving into, which all sounds probably very loosey-goosey or whatever word you would use, but it works. Some of those guardrails could be things like values, but others could be more simple rules that help you make decisions so that you don't go too far to either a really radical, risky change or the other direction to something that looks like complacency, putting your head in the sand.
You got your start observing early automation.
Mm-hmm.
Speak to that experience, because I'm curious to your view over time, because we're going back a few years here to when you first had those observations and then where we are today, because it sure seems like today, major corporations, to the extent they can eliminate human capital, sure seem to be desirous of doing that very thing, eliminating human capital.
I love that you went all the way back to my dissertation. Yeah, I said that my father was an academic and he studied manufacturing. So I always loved plants, manufacturing plants. And so my original research was on how do you implement automation? But what I saw was so much more interesting than here are the steps to implementation. It was tensions. I saw them everywhere. Is technology de-skilling or skill upgrading? Is it about the technology or is it about the people? Is it about power or is it about flexibility? And it is all of those things. That sounds obvious when you say it, but when you're living the experience, so when I was studying the plants that are going through automation, it felt like almost paralysis. And now I look at what's happening with AI and different kinds of technologies around the world and learning and education as well. We're still back to those same questions. And I think that's one of the pieces I would stress of paradox is that you don't solve the problem. It's not like you can say, I did it. I made a decision. It's gone. It will come up again. And so we're looking at AI and saying, okay, how do we make sure that it actually empowers and enables the people who are using it at the same time as the people, the humans, are saying, how do I understand and get my head around something that is so increasingly complicated to do so? It can get out of control in that way. Are those the kind of examples you're seeing?
Well, let me shift it on you. I love shifting on guests. If I don't bring it up now, it'll skip my mind. But given your position in academia, the fact that you're around so many students and you've got a couple decades here of experience being around young people, my observation of America in the last 4 or 5 years is it does seem like young people have taken on a lot more responsibility of social debates, various social debates. And so there's a lot more on their plate. I've got a nephew who is a freshman at UVA right now. And I've been asking about some of his experiences all this summer as he's playing a sport. So I'm curious your perspective on young people. Like, okay, here I am, a Gen X guy. What has been the shift? Because I sometimes find myself very easily relating to certain groups and then not relating to other generations so well.
I hear both sides. Not both. I think there are many sides to what the young generation is that I'm sure are outside of my door somewhere right now. Yes, they're very passionate about broader wicked problems, and they're still young. And one of the things that I note, it's that classic challenge, if not paradox of wisdom, that the more you know, the more you don't know, is how do we foster in these young people the curiosity and humility to listen and learn and explore alternative views? The reason I note that is I love that passion. I mean, I hear it all the time and strong advocacy for views, but I also at times can worry that we're not equipping them well enough to have discussions.
There's a big desire for censorship. There's a big desire to shut voices down. I mean, I am a free speech absolutist. If it's not fire in a crowded theater, I'm a free speech guy. And that has changed across generations, hasn't it?
I think at times it has, and that concerns me a lot. I'm right with you. I mean, if we are going to help the next generation become the leaders of the future to continue to improve our world, they have to be able to not stand up and the first thing they do is argue their point, but have the humility and curiosity to say, help me understand yours. And I'm afraid sometimes we've encouraged them to jump over that and really start immediately into the angry debating. these are young people that they don't have enough to debate on. You get to be my age and certainly older. And I'm so impressed by the wisdom of really brilliant individuals I've had the pleasure of working with as leaders and others whose immediate response is, oh, let me listen. Let me hear tell me where you're coming from. What's been your experience to bring you to this point? It changes the entire dialogue when you start at that point. I don't want to start debating with you. I want to understand where you're coming from. Don't make a case to me. Share with me your experiences. Pick it. Is it on abortion? Is it on race? Tell me about your upbringing. What is it that's helped shape your thinking? And let's get everybody around this table to share theirs. Don't tell me your position on this thing. I want to hear where you're coming from and why. That's one of the things that we're trying to do. And I know a lot of academics are trying to do nationwide, worldwide, is say, let's build the critical thinking, not your ability to argue and advocate, but to listen, learn, and actually develop your own thoughts.
Since I've been doing this podcast, we mentioned Daniel Kahneman earlier, and I've reached out to a lot of interesting people, a lot of interesting academics that come on here. I find these days, though, I get pitched a lot of different ideas for the show, and I invariably can't go there. Because if I look at your CV and I look at your background, like, okay, I don't know exactly where she's going to come from personally, but I can see the broad critical thinking to where it's like, we can have a conversation. I already know this before we talk. We can have a conversation. But I'm seeing so many thought leaders where it's like, I can't have them on because if I don't agree with everything they've laid out, it's just going to be a conflict. And then I don't really even want that type of podcast because then I'm just, I don't know, the old CNN crossfire, two people yelling at each other. I don't want that. But it's really interesting that so many people are carving out, here is the position, it's this no matter what. And if you disagree, you are evil incarnate.
And then we just limit ourselves in so many ways, Michael, if that's the way we do it. Actually, Wendy's at a climate conference right now, and we were having some discussions with academics that were helping put it on a couple of weeks ago, just to think about how to bring out paradoxical tensions in those discussions. And it was interesting because these are really great academics and very paradoxical thinkers in many fronts. But they were talking about who was going to be there. And I said, I don't think you've got all the views at the table. They said, what do you mean? I said, basically, everybody at the table wants to do how. They don't just want a better, cleaner environment. They want to do it the way that you're talking about. So you don't have others. One person said, oh, you mean deniers? No, we don't have to. I said, but as soon as you make that label, you've not just diminished, but also dehumanized lots of other people's views. I would suggest that the people you've just lumped, I mean, I'm sitting in the Midwest. I think there are plenty of people around me. I know plenty of friends and family members who would be lumped into that category. What if instead of saying, look, we all want a better world, give me a better sense of what you see as challenges and opportunities. And what you'd find is these people that have been lumped into certain categories, they might say, I'm really worried about national sovereignty. And then they look at what's happening in Ukraine and say, see, I'm really worried about pushing too far for those that don't have the capability to manage the expense of being green. And then you look at Sri Lanka and they say, see, and you say, okay, this isn't about deniers versus activists. This is a much bigger, messier problem that is climate change. How do we have conversations that say, we all want a better world? There's so many different ways to get there. How do we get all the challenges on the table, let alone the solutions? I use that example because, to your point, I can be in rooms and that conversation just stops. Suddenly, it's like, well, maybe she's in denial too. And I'm like, no, I'm saying we all want a better world. And we're not going to get there if we don't actually have the conversations. I don't want the crossfire either.
Just to give a factoid, I mean, here I am in Vietnam, and one of the biggest issues in Vietnam is what's happening to the Mekong River because China upriver has put untold numbers of dams. And so then that raises a larger issue with China. And look, I've been to mainland China many times. People are very nice to me. Everything's different. It's something different. One of my good friends is married to a Chinese lady. He loves the place, American guy. But, you know, they're at a point now where they are still in that kind of growth stage. They're looking to play catch up to New York City, so to speak. And they're catching up pretty quick. But it's an interesting thing where China is not really part of all of the Western climate conversations, whereas they are the ones that are producing more concrete, more coal than just about anybody. And so it's something where I think a lot of the young people, for example, that are all on board with climate just need to, exactly what you're saying is temper it for a moment. Think globally. Think about how big the world is. Where are all the players? What are all the players doing? And how many of the global nation states are actually at the table willing to do something? And then is that something agreeable? It gets complicated. On this podcast, I will have people almost like a buzzword, just climate change, climate change. Most of the time, I don't even go down the rabbit hole because it's not worth it. But you are being intellectually honest to put it out there and say, well, hold on. This is a touch more subtle, a touch more nuanced than just saying you believe or you don't believe.
Oh, I think it's so much more nuanced than that. But that's where I think it is more powerful to say, if we all want a better world, where do we start and how do we work through some of the unintended consequences and challenges? You know, Michael, you just said something that one of the things I certainly try to do with my students and in my own thinking is use kind of a systems thinking lens. And that's a big, complicated, it's about interactions. It just gets messy very quickly. And I think you feel this tension between, okay, the more complicated and nuanced you let your thinking get, the more powerless you can feel. You feel this tension. And I want to push back and say, no, you're not powerless. You just need to understand that, it's the wings of a butterfly type of piece. You do start having conversations at the kitchen table. You do start thinking about your own experience and realize you're in a really big system of complicated interactions. How does it start to multiply? And you run the marathon. So I do see, even as you're saying that, sometimes an issue with going back to the current student generation, they want to make changes now. Absolutely. Then start making changes now. But the way that they approach it concerns me sometimes because we're not giving them the tools to really be systems changers, because you don't change the whole system.
Well, this gets right at the heart of, if I think about the politics of America, it's 50% one side, 50% the other side. So it's either or, right? The way these issues are often debated, and this goes to the business world too, is, to your point, either or. Well, hold on. The other 50% is just not going to disappear if the other 50% gets a 1% edge for 6 months or a year. It's just going to create more angst on the other side to come back and get their 51% versus finding some way to get a damn thing done.
Michael, truly, the political polarization just pains me. It's not just in the US, but it's certainly heavily in the US. We see it so much because the 50-50 split is so much more complicated than that. If you put an issue on the table, it's not Democrat and Republican. There are so many nuances to any issue of merit than what could be on a single platform. I think one of our challenges with those platforms is you have to oversimplify into this really loud and potentially kind of fear-based approach on either side. And we need to have the discussions into the nuances. I'd like us to be at least able to have those in the smaller setting. I mean, I dream about a more balanced and interactive approach to politics, but I think we have to start where we can as well.
Do you think it's just two people talking and, no one's listening to this conversation, of course. But as a keen observer growing up in the DC area, a keen observer of politics and some political background in my life, do you think we're going to make it in that sense? If I was looking at the trend line seems to be, here you are with this positive approach of saying both and, but it sure looks like the world is pretty heavily going either or. And that trend line looks firmly established to perhaps some moment in time where the train goes off the tracks, so to speak.
You've pegged me well. I mean, I am an optimist. I don't want to be a Pollyanna or a Ted Lasso. And at the same time, I want to find hope. Right now, I think it's very hard in the political sphere because the question is, does it take so much either or to get on a platform that then you've eliminated your opportunity to be both and? I'm going to give you a weird example, but it's just one that feels personal to me. I grew up with the Romneys. We were just family friends with them. And I watched Mitt, who I think is a really interesting politician. He led Massachusetts, one of the most democratic states in the country. He developed what was basically the first Obamacare. But to get onto the platform to run for president, I watched him swing to a narrower view than he had ever practiced. And then, of course, by the time he gets on that podium, people are saying, well, you waffled. I mean, all the criticisms. And I thought, that is such a shame because he had to shift some of what he was doing. I mean, I don't want to sound overly critical of him. I think he did what he felt like he needed to do to become the presidential nominee. But I go back to Mitt Romney often because I think, how are we going to have people on the platform who can be both and thinkers if they have to play an either or game to ever be standing there? And I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, you put the optimistic vibe out there. I'm generally optimistic. I will have to say, though, spending 10 years in Asia, it's definitely shifted my thinking on some things. Whether it's democracy or whether it's communism, most Asian governments are one party. They're pretty much one party places, whether coming down from Japan, China, Vietnam, Singapore, the places that are democracies, it's kind of like lip service, so to speak. Excuse me, my Asian friends, but it's true and you know it. But then again, I see a lot of progress. I see a lack of strife in the Asian countries that to me is just endearing. I don't want to leave that. Because you and I can sit here as two learned people and have a conversation and try and get these issues out there. But what I love about many of the Asian cultures is just that independent self-control, so to speak, that independent, I'm part of the society, I will do my part. Whereas sometimes I think America, there's a little too much acting out. There's not as much self-control as we'd like to see. And so I really love that about Asian cultures. You must like it to some degree, too, when I'm seeing that yin and yang diagram.
I do, but I believe in a multi-party system because I think that gets us into the contrasts that help us continue to push for more innovative and collaborative approaches. One of the things that is interesting, and I'm curious what you've experienced, because I have not had the opportunity to live in Asia the way you are. I've had wonderful opportunities to collaborate with scholars in that area, is even though we use the yin-yang, in our studies of paradox mindset, we've measured thousands of people on this scale and had it translated into Chinese. We expected to have a much stronger cultural difference between people who are paradoxical thinkers and who are not. We didn't find it, Michael. We just fully assumed that if you were raised in kind of a Buddhist Zen culture, you would immediately be more comfortable with the both and. One of the reasons we believe that we don't find the differences is that the yin-yang approach that is truly more Buddhist talks about a middle way. It's a more kind of fluid compromise. It feels more stable and less tense, but it loses the vitality of the extremes. And in the West, we live at the extremes. So how can we do both?
I think you're spot on with that. I was having that conversation with a friend the other day, and we were talking about that America might get there faster on some fronts, but it could be a lot more combustible, a lot more volatile. Whereas, to use the turtle analogy, Asia might go a little slower, but maybe that turtle wins in the long run. And this gets to your whole process here also, because you said the multi-party system that you're laying out a preference for. Then again, if we're thinking both and, there is a lot of single party around the world. If we were to go to Shanghai or Beijing, and we were to look at some of these economies, look at the development of some of these cities, and you say, well, gosh, that's not to be expected. Their city development, their infrastructure looks pretty darn nice compared to some of our American cities. Again, this gets right back to the both and. The world's a big place with a lot of different ways that things have unfolded.
But how do we get to that both and? Because I think the vitality of our extremes, if we could interact better across those extremes, opens up, in my view, better possibilities, more creative, more inclusive for the future. I get your point about the tortoise and the hare, but I'm not sure the endpoints would be the same.
No, they probably won't be. They probably won't be. It's a fascinating thing. For me, I'm looking about 8,000 miles away from you. A completely different environment. I mean, I'm still an American guy with a lot of my American thinking, but via the process of osmosis, that Buddhism starts to sink in over the years. I'm not sure what it's done to me exactly, you know. Probably makes it for a more interesting conversation for people like yourself to have the Saigon podcaster grab you than just the typical perspective.
It does. I do believe one of the beauties of the Asian approach to yin yang is this calm that we will get there. So you don't feel the angst, I think, of the tensions that we might feel in the US. And I'm not sure without the vitality of the extremes, we can get to quite the bold, creative, positive future. I just think that the challenge of the polarization right now in the US and Europe, for that matter, a lot of Europe, is making it awfully difficult to even have conversations that can push that ball forward.
The book, Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. Marianne, with your co-author, Wendy Smith. Cool stuff. I don't know if you knew what to expect on this conversation today exactly, but it's a difficult topic because there is a lot of theoretical, there is a lot of philosophical here. And I think by you and I going across the minefield, so to speak, and letting you get people into your way of thinking, that gives them a entry-level course before the book to get people into that, to where you want them to be seeing, which is ultimately, I get back to thinking about consistency. So many people just, I must have this consistency. They don't think that the world doesn't necessarily conform to your vision of consistency necessarily. There's going to be some volatility. There's going to be some uncertainty, and you got to have the ability to adapt. I love the fact that you really pushed on the critical thinking in this conversation. And I love the fact that even when I pushed you on some things, and I didn't know where you were going to go, and you've laid out a lot of different perspectives, I think anyone listening would say, well, I don't necessarily know where she comes from politically exactly. And that's probably the best conversation, because that means you put a lot of different thoughts on the table that most people don't want to do today. Most people are just like, hey, I'm going to play it safe. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying this. I'm sure today, some people listening that might be to the right, they're mad. Some people listening to the left, they're mad. I'm sure.
We thought that a lot in writing the book. And Wendy and I have different views on a lot of things, but I appreciate the way your type of questions, Michael, because if you start in the minefields, why not? Right? Because if we start there, you can realize if you can work through some of the bigger challenging minefields, well, then what about your more day-to-day challenges of work and life? Work and family, of hybrid work, of how do I manage for today and tomorrow? How do I focus on performing and learning? I mean, there's so many tensions that we deal with on an ongoing basis, but you push me to think about the bigger pieces. And I hope that what you can see, and this is the work that we tried to do with our research and encapsulated in the book of Both and Thinking, is that there are tools and understandings that help you navigate.
There's processes that you put out there that give people, okay, it's not just, here's an opinion. No, it's like, hold on, we've got all these complicated issues. Here's a toolkit that you can possibly use to help you navigate so you're not so inefficient, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal. It's about processes. And you're right. I won't typically take a side because I am interested in the process. I believe if we have better processes, we will get to better outcomes at an individual level, an organizational, and a societal. And that was one of the real challenges of writing this book, is primarily our research has been more at the organizational level. We've realized with every paradox and tension we've studied, we've lived them as individuals. They are so human. And they are taken to this broader macro level of society and to these wicked problems. We wanted to show that these patterns of tensions and paradoxes persist everywhere, and the processes translate across. I think that's a bold statement, but I believe it, and I'll continue to do research in this area. And I love conversations like this, Michael, to push. Thank you.
By the way, I just realized as I'm bringing up all these Harvard examples, and I've had a ton of Harvard Business Review Press authors on this podcast, the Harvard Business Review Press as your publisher. I just realized that.
They did.
Where can we send people? What website would you like to direct people to? They can find your academic site easy.
Yes. And that's probably the simplest place. But I would encourage them. Actually, we're just launching a website strictly for the book, but they are very welcome to just find me on my own, either academic website. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. Happy to connect and love opportunities to continue to learn from you and others and really to push my thinking.
Marianne, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. My pleasure, Michael.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.